Video games are dead, or at least that's how it is starting to feel these days. Every single day of the week it feels like there's a new round of layoffs, a new conglomerate, a new gaming publisher. They're laying off a massive percentage of their workforce. We saw it earlier in the year, I believe, with Microsoft. We've got, of course, EA now today laying off 5% of its workforce, 670 employees, according to this Jason Schreier tweet. So what's really happening? Because this isn't even just AAA. The whole industry seems to be in trouble. You've obviously got the big conglomerates like the EAs and the Microsofts, but even the AA industry, like these smaller studios that are out there, so many of them got gobbled up by Embracer or other entities like that. There was all this consolidation going on, and things are going in the toilet there as well. Embracer in absolute panic mode, cancelling games. The new Deus Ex, there was going to be a new Deus Ex apparently, that's gone. So many others, Time Splitters, all cancelled, and who knows what Embracer are really going to do. Will they survive, or in a year or two do they have to pull the plug, and all those studios they own, are they going to be gone? Well, it's not looking good there, but certainly for EA it's not looking much better. You've got PlayStation 2, this was from a day or two ago, where they laid off 900 employees, and there was that meme that did the rounds where Jim Ryan, the CEO, he was out getting his photo taken with, I think, a London PlayStation studio, and they were all happy smiles, wishing Jim the very best, because he's going to be retiring soon. And then, like, a day or two after these happy photos are taken, Jim Ryan shuts down that whole team who were happy to see him, and he's just going to sail off into the sunset. No real consequences for him. But what does this really all mean? I mean, a lot of people will say that it's purely just a COVID correction. All these studios, tech companies in general, they hired up, they absolutely overstaffed, and now they're in trouble because the line, the graph, it isn't trending upwards, and therefore these teams, these executives especially, are in panic mode because they can't give a huge return on investment to all those shareholders that we as gamers all absolutely care about. So things aren't going well on the financial point of view, but something else is happening that's quite interesting, I think. And this is in games, it's also in movies, I'm finding as well, probably television as well. It's kind of like you can't predict what's going to be a huge success anymore. Game developers, there was definitely a period, maybe the mid sort of 2010s, a little bit after that, where live service games just seemed like a sure thing bet, where you just made some sort of ongoing revenue stream game. You maybe tied it to a well-known IP, whether it was maybe superheroes or maybe something else, a cash generator IP like Call of Duty. And those games would just absolutely print money. It seemed like it didn't matter what the game industry did, as long as they targeted an audience of basically morons and just said, here's the new shiny thing, they did the marketing, then they would make endless piles of cash. But things seem to be changing. You have these titles like the Pal Worlds, the Baldur's Gate 3s. If you're a betting person, you like to gamble, I don't think many people would have gotten that right in 2023 if they were picking the games that either sold the best or had the best profit margins, because it just seemed like every success story was totally unexpected. It went against the norm. And that has to panic these huge conglomerate companies, the Sonys, the Microsofts, the EAs, because they run off spreadsheets, off data analytics. They don't make any creative decisions. They just look at the graphs and they rely on them to tell them what's going to make them money. And that doesn't seem to be doing it quite as much anymore. I mean, the Call of Duties, sure, they still make money, but they're extremely expensive to make. People were quite shocked about this PlayStation news, especially because people thought, yeah, it might not be going well for Xbox. Remember, everyone was clowning on them a couple of weeks ago when it looked like they were going third party, but you could kind of predict that because Xbox, Microsoft didn't seem to be doing so well in the gaming space. But PlayStation, they seem to be the industry darlings. They're doing it all right. They no longer have real competition because Nintendo are doing their own thing and Xbox are failing. Doesn't seem to be the case at all, because even something like Spider-Man 2, Is it on paper a commercial success? You would have thought so. It's probably sold 10, 15 million copies, or at least it will very soon. But it cost $300+ million to make. I'm pretty sure that was the number, which is a ludicrous amount of money for what is basically a sequel to an established game already. I don't think Spider-Man 2 is that much different. Haven't personally played it, but that's kind of Sony's problem. I see no reason to buy a PlayStation. Why am I going to bother? I know that game will eventually come to PC, my preferred platform, and I'm happy to wait. Spider-Man 2 is not a must-play for me. I don't think it's a must-play for a lot of people because it feels like more of the same. But it cost $300+ million. So where is the profit margin there? Because even if it's sold well, I can't imagine it's bringing in bucket loads of cash for Sony. Whereas a game like a Pal World, I imagine the budget wasn't huge. It was a Steam bestseller. It was on Game Pass, meaning Microsoft had to hand over quite a bit of money. So they're probably raking it in, and they're doing it much more low risk than a Sony. So again, that's got to panic the industry a bit because they couldn't predict that a Pal World would be a success. They wouldn't green light something like that because they would just assume, no, all our metrics say it's going to fail. Well, it seems things are different. Gamers are seeing things different. They're not getting sucked in quite as much anymore, where a shiny advertisement, a commercial, a trailer, a cinematic trailer with set pieces, no real gameplay, that crap isn't going to sell anyone anymore. And I guess for some evidence of that, if we look at some of the top sellers, now I don't know if these websites are 100% accurate, but it seems about right. You would think it's pretty close, where we can see the top best-selling video game releases on Steam last year. Again, you couldn't predict some of these. Some of these you maybe can, but if we look at Baldur's Gate 3, no one thought that was going to be a huge commercial success. I certainly didn't. I bought it for early access 3 years ago, whenever it came out, and I thought, it's good, but it's going to be a niche game. That was my prediction. I thought, at best, it will hit around Divinity Original Sin 2 numbers, and that's about it. But Jesus Christ, it absolutely popped off. So it rightfully is in number 1 on PC, makes sense. Hogwarts Legacy, now that is one that you would assume would have done well, but what's a bit different about it is not the sort of game that Warner Brothers, the publisher, would traditionally green light. They've banged on and on about it's all going to be live service from here, and even with Suicide Squad totally failing, and them having to come out and admit it was a total flop, it's rubbish, they've still talked about reinvesting in live service. Everything is going to have to be that cash machine, that conveyor belt money generator, and they're going to continue it. I think there's a Quidditch game coming out in the Hogwarts universe, and I imagine that's going to be a live service. So even with this success, they don't seem like they're going to change their strategy, which is kind of odd. I mean, how many times do you have to fail with titles like Suicide Squad to learn? They had Marvel's Avengers to point to as a reference, which also failed. What are you doing? But some of these games, Lethal Company, I think that was made by one dev, and it's the 3rd best-selling game on Steam of the year. That is amazing. You might see Overwatch 2, but that was a free download on Steam. And I'm pretty sure this isn't counting microtransaction sales. So it's like, oh, bravo Blizzard, you're able to get people to download something for free. Pretty funny. Sons of the Forest, that's a pretty small indie title as well. And then, of course, Starfield. It was meant to be the 10-year game that we were going to be playing endlessly. If this many people installed it, they bought it, I'm sure this many people also uninstalled it. They're not going to be coming back to it at all. So that was a big fail, even if it's on this list. BattleBit Remastered, though, that's like an indie version of Battlefield. And it's done remarkably well because it doesn't have all of EA's crap in it. Maybe EA, if you'd made something like that, you wouldn't have to be laying off 5% of your workforce. People don't need the fancy graphics. They don't need the diversity stuff. Like, I think it was it Battlefield 1, where it was like World War 1, but it was a diverse cast, diverse soldiers in the war, which didn't make any sense, but they went for it and they told people not to play it. Well, clearly people haven't been playing your games for a while because you seem to be doing quite poorly. Resident Evil 4, you'd expect that to do well, and I think that's another example of where it didn't take 6 years to make. It probably had a sensible budget for what it was. It sold well. I don't see that often Capcom having some sort of disaster, having to lay everyone off, because they seem a bit smarter with what they're doing. And I mean, I also want to look at reality as well. So if we look at sales of games overall, not just on Steam, but also consoles, yeah, a lot of the usual suspects are here. Call of Duty Modern Warfare 3, which is a total disaster, cash grab, borderline scam. It's basically DLC and they repackaged it into a full game so Bobby can make some more money before he left. He went out the door. That seems to have sold well. You've got your Maddens. Mortal Kombat 1, I assume that's a live service. EA Sports, which is like FIFA essentially. A lot of these games will keep selling, but the problem is these companies want the line to go up. So they can't just release the same 3 or 4 games each year, the next Call of Duty, the next Madden, and they're not actually going to make more money because wages slowly go up, expenses go up. So they actually need to be making more games that are making more money. They can't just have these flops alongside the obvious cash cows. And that's really where they've struggled most, is anything they've tried to release outside the core couple of games just hasn't done very well. I mean, Diablo 4's on this list, but I don't think it did nearly as well as they were hoping. It might have sold well out the gate, but they were really banking on lots and lots of people playing this, like a Path of Exile, and retaining those players, selling them $65 horses, I think it was, microtransactions. Other shit like that, and I don't think people are buying because people have stopped playing. They've moved on to games like Last Epoch, that's another smaller, I guess an indie title, and similar titles again like Path of Exile. So the games that aren't guaranteed juggernauts are just not doing well. I mentioned that in movies it's kind of similar, where like the next big Avengers, or at least the next big superhero movie that comes out, I don't think most people have confidence that that's going to do well anymore. Whereas if you go back 5 years, a new Avengers or Marvel movie was like guaranteed to print $1 billion. Now you're looking at the Super Mario Brothers movie. Did anyone think that was going to be like the biggest success ever? Sure, the name's quite big, but Mario hasn't really had the best name in cinema, if you remember the old Dennis Hopper movie. So it was kind of a risk there. And then you've obviously got the Oppenheimers and the Barbies, which you would have assumed they'd done okay, but they wouldn't have been like the biggest movies, the biggest releases of the year. So bit like with movies, they can't seem to predict what's going to be a huge success. Games, it feels kind of the same, which is why I think a lot of these publishers, these Sonys and so on, are in some sort of panic mode. The gamers are kind of panicking as well, because seeing all the layoffs is like, well, what's going to happen from here? Because if you look at the PlayStation 5, for instance, there hasn't been a lot of exclusives. Whereas if you go back 10 years ago, the PS4, you were getting the Bloodborns, you were getting new IPs from Sony, whereas this time around it's rehashes. It's sequels to Horizon, God of War. You're getting remakes, remasters of The Last of Us, no new games from Naughty Dog. So what's kind of happening? It's weird. Games are just taking way too long to make, and even when they come out, they're so safe and just so generic, it feels like, because the publishers are afraid to take risks because they've had to put so much money into it. Why is this even happening? I mean, the graphics side, I've always felt like the game publishers push graphics on players and try and convince people that graphics are the be-end and end-all, and I assumed it was because they were worried about indie devs sort of competing with them, because if AAA games just had basic graphics, then indie titles could look similar, and you'd only be competing on gameplay, and indie games are almost always going to be more creative because they can afford to take those risks. They haven't got hundreds of millions of dollars at stake. I really thought it's the AAA industry pushing the graphics, but that seems to just be a huge problem now because the returns are no longer there. The amount you've got to spend on the art teams, on your staff, it's ludicrous. And I feel like the bigger these companies become, it's just too hard to do anything. Once people get into video games and just treat it like a 9-to-5 job, it's going to be impossible to really do anything, because in the old days, you go back to your favorite games from the 90s, the early 2000s, the only people working on games were super passionate people who were willing to stay up all night to work on your favorite game, because it was their favorite thing to do. It was their passion. But now you do have a lot of people in games, I feel, who are there for maybe other reasons. It's to go, I don't like this hobby because it appeals to the male fantasy. I'm going to go ahead and insert my agenda into things and make sure that what you're playing lines up with my worldview. If it lines up with yours, that's toxic and that's bad, that's evil, we can't have that. There's a lot of that going on. And I guess the question from here is, what is the solution? If the surefire wins, those live services aren't making all of the money anymore, and publishers, that they can't really predict what's going to be a success. If we're real, they're just not creative enough anymore to make these Baldur's Gate 3s, those sorts of games that come out. That takes something special. Larian and the team working on Baldur's Gate. I mean, they'd already had years and years worth of experience making great games. The Divinity series, it's been good to some extent for like 25 plus years. They refined things with Original Sin, and all of that resulted in Baldur's Gate 3. I don't think an EA is going to be able to do it, certainly not a Microsoft. When has Microsoft last actually made a good game? It's been decades. It isn't going to happen. So what are they really going to do? Well, I think they need to go back to basics. At the very least, they can't just focus on scale, where every game has to get bigger. You just end up with a bloated mess like Ubisoft modern games, the Assassin's Creeds and so on, which are big. They've got hundreds of hours, but it feels totally pointless. The dollar fun value that they try and sort of use, that mindset where it's like, for every dollar you spend, you get an hour's gameplay. So if the game costs $80, you get 80 hours. It's a great deal, right? Well, I believe more in quality over quantity. I want to play something that's actually fun. I don't care if it's 5 hours. If it's an incredible experience, I'll take it. I've played many great horror games that are short, for instance, that are great. I mentioned Resident Evil 4. Not a long game, but it is a lot of fun. Dead Space, that was similar. I love my RPGs, many of which are humongous, but it doesn't have to be all like that. And there was a post here on NeoGAF on a gaming forum where someone sort of talks about that, because gamers are starting to panic, especially when they're talking about things like crunch is going to return, but we need even more than that. I saw someone else talking about how we need to start paying $150 for every single game. I'm okay spending a bit more on a quality game, but the idea that if we spend $150, suddenly the games will be good and the publishers will focus on making good games, I don't necessarily believe that. I think they'll do the same things. They'll just charge more money, and once it's normalized, there'd be no going back. So I'm not too sure about that, advocating for all games to be more expensive. Maybe not. But this person mentions what hasn't really been reported in all of the news about layoffs is that the return of crunch culture is going to return, and I doubt when it does it will get anywhere close to the reporting it has recently. Those who complain about crunch are going to be let go. Well, as I mentioned, in the old days, smaller teams of passionate people making games, they were absolutely crunching. You didn't hear about it because they weren't complaining, because they were happy to be doing it. However, I can't imagine anyone, no matter what they feel about video games, is super excited to be crunching on Modern Warfare 3 when it's a cash grab, there's no passion, and the developers are probably embarrassed about what's going on. Who's going to be enthusiastic about crunching when it comes to that? No one. So I'm not too sure about this. I think too many of these organizations, these companies, the Microsofts and so far now, they probably can't get away with this sort of stuff as much without it getting out there and the public getting outraged and all of that. I think these organizations, they just run too much like a normal office now. It's not a bunch of nerds in a room, anything goes. Even if crunch is there, I don't think it will be like it is in the past. These layoffs are honestly just the start of recalibration of salaries in the industry and a reanalysis of redundant positions. For example, you see a lot of community managers losing their jobs. Companies have to ask whether or not games need community managers and how much that augments game sales. In reality, it's probably a job you could have an intern do, or AI. I think, let's be honest, that's the way things are probably going. In games, they would be some of the first jobs, I assume, you get a machine to do instead. And I mean, there's all this talk about diversity hires and people getting the job, maybe not on merit. Are those people some of the people who are getting let go? Maybe, maybe not. We'll have to see. But I suppose anything to just ensure it's quality over quantity. I'm not convinced the bigger the team, the better the product, or even the faster a product comes out. It seems to be the opposite sometimes. So I'm not someone who's, while it's sad that some people lost their jobs, I don't think it's the worst thing if the industry gets a little bit smaller. I don't like everything just blowing up massively. Like I said about games, it's not like the bigger the game, the better it is. It's the same for the teams. Games need to come out more polished and less bloated. I don't care about games being 20 plus hours. Most of the best games I've ever played are 16 hours or shorter. This is especially true of single player games. These shorter games I've played multiple times because there's no bloat in them. The most bloated part of Metal Gear Solid was the Wolf mission and the keycard. I haven't played that yet. I have purchased it, those shoddy remakes. This was going to be my first attempt to play Metal Gear Solid, so I won't spoil that for myself, but I have played it. He mentions Super Metroid, 8-hour game. Yes, it is. Now, it's easy to say that, but if you release, like, literally just a new version of Super Metroid, new content, but basically the same game, I don't think people would necessarily be hugely excited by that. It's like if Nintendo released another game very similar to the original Mario Brothers, Super Mario Brothers, the original NES one, I think it was. I don't think anyone would be pumped. Even if Super Mario Wonder is along similar lines, there's enough new stuff to keep people excited about it. However, Nintendo have had the right ideas. It seems like they're the ones who don't have bloating budgets, bloating costs, and they seem to be getting it right, a focus on fun, not technology, not getting a good Digital Foundry review. It's about the gameplay. So maybe there is something to be learned from there. I really don't understand why Sony, Microsoft don't hone in on that. I think it's a lack of confidence in actually making a genuinely fun game. They think they've got to get the sales in from visuals, from advertising. They can't just let the game stand on its own 2 feet. Indie developers don't have a choice. They've got to put the gameplay first. They can't compete on graphics. Open world games have been one of the worst advancements in gaming because not everyone puts in the time to building them like Rockstar. Until AI can help fill out these worlds, the industry needs to take a step back from open world. I'd agree that they're way too big. The only time I had fun in Assassin's Creed was probably playing the Ezio trilogy. They were probably the right size. They ballooned from there and they got stale and just really not fun. Like, you just open up the map and you sort of groan and you're like, oh, more of this. You're not excited to explore these worlds. I actually finished a replay of the original Gothic very recently. Very small open world. Super fun though. Everything's got a purpose in the world. Every nook and cranny, there's a reason for it being there pretty much. Like, I'd like these open world games to go back to that. We need to return to tight storytelling, tight gameplay mechanics, polished games that are ready for prime time on day one. There's some truth to this. I don't know if any of this will ever happen, regardless of the layoffs. I can agree that too many games released broken. I get that a lot of that did happen in the past, and maybe it's nostalgia goggles because we play, say, an old game years later and we think, oh, that was pretty polished, but it's probably had years of patching. I think of like Bloodlines 1, you just had fan patches. How many of us have actually played the original release when it was broken? Probably not that many. So there is, I guess, some bias there, recency bias, where like Jedi Survivor's a total joke on PC when it releases. Anything like that, that's how you kill companies. And again, EA, that's how you have to lay off all of your staff because you're releasing games in such a shoddy state. I would have bought that on release day one if it was acclaimed, but it's still got mixed reviews on Steam. So I gave it a miss. It hasn't had a sale yet that I'm happy with. So that's probably an example. Get the polish right, and maybe you can get that polish right by reducing the scope of some of these games. I should probably say that Respawn, who made Jedi Survivor, they at least seem to be doing okay in that they release games in a reasonable time frame, 4 years. But clearly that 4 years wasn't enough for Survivor, so what do I know, really? It is the case with a lot of studios, though, that they balloon out to 6-year dev times. That is scary, because as we get older, we're going to play like 1, maybe 2 games from each studio a decade? Surely that's not sustainable. The industry, something's going horribly wrong, at least in the AAA space. It's hard to celebrate because it's even affecting smaller studios when you've got the Embracers, Microsoft's consolidating. You just hope that some good games will come out of this crap eventually. Some games that are mainstream can be good. We saw it with Baldur's Gate. And the indie games, I'm sure they'll keep ticking along, but hopefully more people just keep giving them a chance. We've seen it with some of the live service indie games like your Lethal Companies. Hopefully it happens with more of the single player ones as well, and they do well, and maybe they inspire some of the bigger companies, and maybe one day it'll be better news for the AAA industry. But thanks so much for listening. I'll see you on the next one. Cheers. Bye.